In this recording, we're going to go over a couple of very key adjustment layers, the curves and the levels. Now these are two very important adjustment layers while you're doing any sort of photographic editing, and any advanced photo editing tutorial that I have uses these, and they use them in a manner where I just assume that you know pretty much everything about them, or at least to a certain extent. So it's really important that we dig into this so beginners aren't completely lost, because I really want people to have a good understanding of what they're actually doing. It makes for good editing, it makes for confident editing, and it gives just a good overall understanding of how a camera works and how real light works. So over to your right, there are going to be some windows that are going to be necessary for what we're doing. If you don't have any of the windows that I'm talking about, go over to your Windows tab, and you're going to need your histogram. It may already be up. History, of course, layers, navigator is usually pretty important. I always keep that up. And the properties. Hit your histogram tab, and if it doesn't look like this already, you probably, maybe you have something that kind of looks like that, or something that has like all these different colors and it looks kind of weird, but we want to be in the expanded view, and we actually want to be on the RGB feed. And this kind of tells us the tonal range of the photo itself. And the reason that the histogram is pretty important, instead of just going over to your levels and actually checking the histogram that way and being able to edit it at the same time, is so that on a quick note, you know exactly what you need to edit in the photo, or whether you even need to edit the photo. But for this sake, we're just going to edit through anyway. So go over to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and Levels. You don't really need to rename it. Any of these settings can be done after the fact. This isn't super important, so hit OK. And you can see this histogram that pops up here is pretty much the same as this histogram. And you can also go through your RGB, or you can really go through individual colors, red, green, blue. We'll get to that in a bit. In the meantime, you have three triangle points here. You have your shadows, your midtones, and your highlights. When you bring these in, you can see that some pretty drastic adjustments are made. Go back over to our navigator. I'm going to zoom in. We're going to work on the shadows first. And we're going to focus on maybe like his hat and his shirt, just because they're probably one of the darkest things in the image. Maybe his gauges or some spot over here, but that doesn't really matter. You can see over on your levels adjustment that the peak actually doesn't start all the way over to the side, as it probably should. So anytime you have a gap from the very beginning to where the incline starts, just take that tab and move it over to where the incline actually starts. And you can see on his shirt and his hat, just that adjustment alone made it slightly darker. What we're doing is we're telling the program that this shade of gray is actually black, or a super, super dark shade of gray. And likewise, if we were to do that on the highlight side, but this actually kind of starts really where it should, then we would bring that in and say that, you know, whatever this would be the new white. But when you do that, then you tend to blow out whatever information is left over here, and that's not really okay. That needs to be used with a lot of subtlety. So let's talk about these midtones. Here's where we get into some science. And don't freak out, it's not anything super serious, just basic physics about lights. Things that you'll find pretty cool and actually can apply to all of your photo work. This midtone setting is technically the gamma setting, and for those who just kind of know what gamma is in photo, you might think that you're just making it more or less hazy. And in a sense, that's kind of what you're doing, but to understand it a little better, gamma is actually like a magnetic field, and it has a numerical value to it. And this numerical value involves the amount of photons and the energy that they possess. In this instance, we're worried about how many photons, it's that energy of light, is actually hitting the emulsion on the photo. For those who have taken photo classes, you probably know a bit about this already, but for the sake of those who don't, the emulsion of a photo, a physical photo, is a sensitive coating. It usually has a form of crystals on it in almost a gelatin form. It's microscopic, so you don't have like jello-y pictures or anything, but that's what creates the shadows and highlights on a photo, essentially what makes your photo. Those who have been in photo classes know that if you don't expose it to the light long enough, your photo is going to look kind of hazy, it's going to look a little weird. Now sometimes this effect can be kind of cool, but not most of the time, or if you expose it too long, it's going to be really dark and the photo just isn't going to turn out and it's going to look really dumb. Try to keep that in mind as you move this midtone around and you move this gamma around and digitally manipulate how much of that quote-unquote haze is present. Now we have selected the RGB, the red, green, blue. That represents those three colors together as a whole. In light, when you put together all of the represented colors, you get white, or just simply clear light is how you can describe that. And of course that's unlike paint, where if you smash all the colors together, you're going to get something black or dark brown or something nasty, unless that's really what you're intending to do. So we can go into these individual red, green, and blue instead of doing everything together and just manipulating how much light altogether is hitting it or how much white light is actually hitting everything. We can go into your red channel, you can move your shadows, you can move your highlights, you can move your midtones. And you can create some pretty cool effects. I'm going to go into deeper detail about what all of these things do when we go into the curves, but this is a really decent way of doing simple color manipulation to your photos. So that really goes over what the levels are all about. And you see these eyedroppers, we're going to go over that in the curves. It's the same principle. So delete your levels and go into layer, new adjustment layer, curves. Same deal, don't need to really mess with anything or rename it. And you get this weird box that pops up and you're like, I don't even know why it's called curves, because there's nothing curvy about this thing. And the reason it's called curves is because you're supposed to put a curve into it. Any sort of manipulation that you would do, well, most manipulations that you would do on here anyway, would cause some sort of a curve in this line. I'm just going to start out what I just did there. If you click on here and you get a point and then you're like, oh no, I don't want that point to be there, just go directly over the point, click, hold, drag it off, and it'll delete it. So moving on, we also have our RGB settings here. It does the same thing as the levels, with this as being diagonal. The curves are far more detailed. The bottom you can think of as specificity, and the side you can think of as sensitivity. Now what this means is the specificity is the proportion of negatives, we'll say, and the sensitivity is the proportion of positives. So think of this section right here as being positive 1, and then this section right here being negative 1. Your specific line down here, your specificity, you can think of that as the measurement of light, how much light is measured right there. And then your sensitivity is the intensity of the light measurement. So how much light, how intense that light is. And then if you want to even bring that to a more familiar terminology, contrast, brightness. To say something has contrast means that it has opposing elements of some sort. Now, knowing that we are measuring the amount of photons that are hitting this digital paper, and also knowing that contrasting means that you are dealing with opposing elements, remember that this is the negative section, and because this is contrast, that means we are adding more light to the photo. Now keep in mind we're working with physical emulsion. So more light to the photo means that you're going to have a darker photo. And then likewise, if we bring this up, remember we're working with contrasting elements, into the +1 section, it means we're going to have less light and it's going to create a haze. So we'll drag this back to center. However, when we're working with simply the brightness, it's pretty intuitive. You bring it up into the positive, you get brighter. You bring it down into the negative, you get darker. That seems to be pretty easy. Now we can go into the red, green, and blue tabs, just as you can with the levels. Only you can get a bit more specific, well, quite a bit more specific about what you want to do with each color. So if we want to make the red tones brighter, but we want to make sure that less can become red. So again, controlling how many of those photons are actually hitting. When we're working with this contrast, we can bring this section downward. Now, if you continue to bring it down, because we're not working in the RGB anymore, we're working in the red, you're going to start hitting the opposing color of red, which is green. So you have whatever elements are left that can be red. They're, you know, a weird kind of pink tone. But now your settings are telling the photo that certain things need to be opposite of red as we are contrasting these red elements here. The same thing applies when we go into green channels. You have green, then you have magenta, and your blue channels, you have blue, and then you have yellow. Because they are all opposite of the color wheel. They're all contrasting colors. Let's look at these eyedroppers and kind of go over exactly what those things do. Just to make sure that I don't have anything, photo looks a little odd, I don't have anything set kind of odd, I'm going to undo all of my adjustments. And you can do that here, or you can move backwards one step with that key. So you can see that these eyedroppers have different shades. You have your shadows, you have your midtones or your gamma, and your highlights, just as you did with the levels. And what these allow you to do is set manually your white balance. You click your shadows and say, you know what, I want this right here to represent the darkest dark. Click on that, and you can see that everything else adjusted accordingly. Picture that levels. Just gonna do this real quick. Picture this level right here moving inward. That's exactly what we're doing, but we're doing it manually. And then you can hit your midtones, and we can go somewhere where we can find some nice midtones. This gray cement looks pretty good, and we're gonna hit somewhere here. And then our highlights, I think, you know, if we wanted to set it there, we could do that. Whoops, maybe if I actually hit the right button, the highlights, let's try this again, and set that there. And there's really not much of a change because, I mean, you can tell that's pretty white as it is, but a couple quick notes. You may see this like little pencil looking tool. It's just so you can be more detailed if you wanted to and go through and actually draw in how you want certain things to look. Of course, it's not quite what you would want to do unless that's the exact effect you're looking for. I really don't think so. But it really does kind of come in handy in some instances. Anyway, I hope that this video kind of cleared some of that up for you guys. I know that this can be kind of technical, and really you can just say, well, this makes this brighter and that makes that more contrasted, but it's really important to know why these settings do exactly what they do. Sometimes the digital aspect of everything makes things seem a bit more simple than what they are, so people are just clicking buttons and going, oh, that looks good, and sometimes that works, but in order to truly edit, and edit very well, you need to understand the science behind all of it.